So working our way down, you'll notice the slides are in a little different order this morning. I go in different directions every semester. There's a million things to say, so as long as we're getting content across. You'll notice there's a picture in your presentation showing the articulation of the coronoid process in the mandibular fossa. And I'll return to that. We're going to talk about joints also. We're not really doing that right now. I'm just trying to put the flesh on the body for you. So we've worked our way down to the neck, and I built a little wave-worn key here to talk about the innervations of these neck muscles. The first good piece of news is most of them are named for their connections. So mylohyoid, mandible to hyoid, stylohyoid, styloid process to mandible, thyrohyoid, etc. These things are named for where they go, for their attachments. And I've created, you can see the large arrows here indicate something that you don't know about yet. So I'm going to teach it to you in just a moment. And that is the ansa cervicalis of the cervical plexus. So we're about to begin on our journey here of the spinal nerves. Thus far, as we have talked about the muscles on the face, mostly of expression and mastication, we've seen innervation from the facial nerve for expression and the mandibular branch of the trigeminal for mastication. Now, as we work our way down into the anterior region of the neck, we're going to begin to see that there are fibers coming to these muscles, nerve fibers coming to them, that are going to be coming out off the spinal cord. Now there's a little, there's some connections here. For example, you remember we talked a little bit about cranial nerve 11, the accessory, last time. Okay, so that'll come up. And we talked about cranial nerve 12, and you're going to see that today connected to the cervical plexus. So here at the bottom, 11 and 12, we see some connections. But in order for you to really understand how these muscles are being controlled by the nervous system, you have to have some more information. And so we're going to pause for maybe 20 minutes or so during class today and go through that information. That way you'll have context for the rest of the muscles that we do. So today's a big day for learning broad, big picture things for the way muscles are innervated. Okay, so let's learn these first. We mentioned the mylohyoid last time and the two bellies of the digastric, which you found in the laboratory. You can see here on your key that the omohyoid from the scapula to the hyoid, and the sternohyoid from the manubrium to the hyoid bone. These guys receive innervation from the ansa cervicalis. So you don't know what that is. I'm going to explain it to you here in just a minute. And then you can see over here other muscles, the stylohyoid, for example, which gets cranial nerve 7, just like the posterior belly of the digastric does. And then thyrohyoid is said to have C1 by 12. C1 by 12. Okay, so I need some more information here with this arrow, the segmental branches. And what do you mean by C1 by 12? And I need some more information here. What do you mean by the ansa cervicalis? So you'll learn these by way of key. You can see here the geniohyoid also gets C1 by 12. And we've talked about the genioglossus, and now you see the geniohyoid from the mandible to the hyoid bone. So you'll need to learn the attachments of these muscles. I've got them listed for you as simply as possible here. And you don't know, I know you don't know what these keys mean yet. So I want to teach you that. So I'm going to do it sequentially. All right, we're going to start with this picture that's not in your book. This is a picture of the spinal cord having been dissected. The spinous processes in the lamina have been removed. And so you can see the spinal cord from a posterior view here. That's why I like this picture. Now, you can also see in this picture that there are things coming off of the spinal cord, and the real emphasis on this picture are the pieces coming off of the dorsal side. Now, this part, you know already. These little swellings here, you can see the little rootlets coming off and being these little swollen portions here. Those little swollen portions there that are coming off the spinal cord are called the dorsal root ganglia. And in those, you find sensory information exclusively. The cell bodies of unipolar neurons and sensory information. There are no exceptions to that rule. I love that in anatomy when there are no exceptions to the rule. Now, what you cannot see on this picture are the roots on the other side. So in addition to these dorsal roots feeding the dorsal root ganglia, on the anterior side, right, several pictures here to look at. We'll go back and forth. On the anterior side, you can see that there are rootlets of the ventral roots. So there's your swollen piece right there in your dorsal root, and here are your rootlets in your ventral root here. All of this information is motor. This you know already. Okay. Now, on this side, they're labeled. So as we continue off of the spinal nerve here, that is the union of the dorsal and ventral roots, what we're going to find is these spinal nerves, as you can see here, extending off, have branches. And so these branches are going to become critical for us. And the ones I'm going to emphasize to you as we do the muscles are the ventral rami of the spinal nerves. So look at the branches coming off of the spinal nerves. This is the key for all of the sensory and motor stuff that we have going on in our bodies. So first, you see there is a dorsal ramus of a spinal nerve coming off here. Those dorsal rami do not equal dorsal roots. The dorsal rami carry axons that are both sensory and motor. So these dorsal rami we're going to see once we get deep in the back. Deep in the back is where we're going to find those dorsal rami. Once we get to the splenius and the semispinalis and the erector spinalis, we will find the dorsal rami of the spinal nerves going there. Everything else that we're going to talk about for muscle innervation will be getting information from the ventral rami. So this one shows here, it's the larger one, it's the big daddy, this is the big piece of information, the ventral rami of the spinal nerves. Now, if we back this up, you can see in this section that it shows these spinal nerves coming off here without the branches, but you can see them extending. And the reason for this picture is to emphasize to you that in the upper and lower portions of the spinal cord, the ventral rami form networks. They form networks of pathways, interconnected pathways. And so at the top up here, you can see these interconnected pathways are called the cervical plexus. We'll see those from C1 to C5. And then you see all these interconnected pathways here called the brachial plexus, basically from C5 down to T1. And then, if you skip down here, you can see down in the lumbar regions from L1 basically down all the way through S5, you can see interconnections there. So we'll call those the lumbar and the sacral plexus. These are interconnected nerve networks that create arguably the biggest nightmare possible for anatomy students. But if you're going to be able to explain how muscles are controlled, if you're going to gain the knowledge of what it looks like in the spinal cord when you have muscle paralysis, what muscles would be affected by which areas of the spinal cord, you're going to have to, these are things that you have to learn. So cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexus. Now, we'll keep backing this up. This picture labels in the center portion of this phenomenon. So there's my cervical, brachial, sacral, lumbar, and sacral plexus. In the central portion of this, you can see that there are nerves that come off that do not form plexus. These are the nerves basically from T1 to T12, the thoracic nerves. And these guys are called the intercostal nerves, and they come off in a simple segmental pattern. They do not have to be memorized. You can guess. If you have anatomical landmarks, you know where the spinous processes are of these things, you know what segment of the spinal cord you're talking about, you can guess, and you can get these right. You don't have to memorize things about the intercostal nerves. Okay, and then finally, back to my original picture, let me mention the rest of the spinal cord doodahs that we'll run into. Okay, so first of all, each root has several rootlets. Students always get the impression early in the semester that there's a single root coming off and it forms the dorsal and ventral root. That's not true. And you can see the multiple rootlets coming off here. And you can see the multiple rootlets coming off here. Now, the second thing is, this information in the spinal nerves is both sensory and motor. This is something that we have talked about a lot. So I'm going to teach you the motor pathways. I'm going to teach you the spinal cord segments, and I'm going to teach you the pathway on the nerves to go to the muscles. I'm not going to teach you the sensory pathways. And here's why. The spinal nerves, the dorsal rami and the ventral rami, both carry sensory and motor information. So if you learn well the motor outputs to the muscles, you will have by default learned the sensory stories. Almost without exception. Let me show you what I mean by that. Any textbook that's going to teach you about muscles or innervation stuff is going to tell you that the spinal nerve that feeds a particular area of muscle is going to be called a myotome. But no textbook that I have seen has individual pictures of those myotomes, the sections of muscles that are innervated, because students have to memorize the spinal cord segment all the way through the nerve to the muscle. So there's no reason really to memorize the myotomes. But every textbook also has this picture on it called dermatomes. And if derma makes you think of the skin, then you got the right place. Because a dermatome is a section of skin that is innervated by spinal cord segments. And as it turns out, the dermatomes and the myotomes nearly match up identically, which means if you learn the nerve pathway to the muscle, you've learned this by default. So let's just have a look at this. As we were beginning to talk about the neck a minute ago, we said C1 to C3 by 12. And you can see here labeled C2 and C3 in this area. So I'm going to tease this apart for you in the cervical plexus, and you're going to see this particular phenomenon in a myotome. These are the spinal cord segments feeding these neck muscles. You can see on the back here, C3, C4, C5. And so we're going to begin to see, as we turn over and look at the trapezius, the segmental branches of the cervical plexus feeding the trapezius. And I will talk about the segments, and they will match up pretty closely with these. As you work your way down to the arm here, you can see here this little green section. C5 and C6 are labeled, and you can see, I always point this one out because it'll jump out to you, C5 and C6 here as a dermatome labeled on the lateral portion of the skin of the forearm. So this will be the first two segments that we will learn in the brachial plexus. And I'll bring it out, I'll bring the brachial plexus nerve out, and we'll look at the musculocutaneous first, coming off the lateral, feeding the lateral cord, and the lateral cord feeding the musculocutaneous, and it'll come down here and it'll feed the bicep. So we'll see C5 and C6 in this area right here, feeding the bicep brachii. And then, as we proceed down further, we'll see the musculocutaneous go superficial in the forearm, C5 and C6. So I'll be tracking the nerves. You'll be learning the dermatomes. You won't realize it while you're doing it, unless I point it out, which I always forget to do. But I wanted to show you this up front. This is also a useful picture for people who are thinking about back injuries, because where do back injuries normally happen?
Your lower back.
Lower back, yeah. So we're normally talking about L4, L5, L5, S1. That's normally where the injuries are, right? So if you look at the dermatome here, you can see the sensory piece coming from the dermatomes labeled L4 and L5, and you can see this L5 segment here. This is this L5-S1 segment right here. This is the most common pain that people feel when they have back injuries. It's along, normally it's along the lateral, more lateral regions of the leg. You can see L5 and S1 there. And so if they can isolate the pain in their leg, then you can isolate the location in the spinal cord where the injury is, just by knowing the general features of this dermatome. Also, when we're talking about the lumbar plexus, I'll show you the union of L2, L3, and L4 forming the femoral nerve. And I'll show you how we get there. L2, L3, L4 come together and they form this large nerve. There's two pieces. One obturator goes to the medial part, femoral goes to the front. And I'll say the quadriceps, the vastus medialis, the vastus lateralis, and the rectus femoris, and the vastus intermedius, all four of these quadricep muscles right here get the femoral nerve. And you'll learn the femoral nerve comes from L2, L3, L4. And you see what just happened? You learned the dermatome by learning the motor output to that muscle. Okay, so major emphasis here, you don't need to memorize this picture. I just want you to know that dermatomes are a very famous way of talking about sensory information, and it's a useful image. It is an image that will become default for you as you learn the spinal cord segments feeding the myotomes, the motor outputs. All right? So, a reminder of sensory and motor, yes? Sensory information and motor information in these spinal nerves. We're going to be talking about motor. All right? Now, the dorsal and ventral roots change as we go down the spinal cord. So as we begin this, we're going to be looking at the ventral roots feeding the ventral rami of the spinal nerves. That's where our focus will be. As you proceed down the spinal cord, you will discover that the spinal cord itself ends at the second lumbar segment. So let's look at that. You can see here, L1, L5 nerves are shown here, and you can see this cone-shaped region of the spinal cord here at L2. This is where it ends, right here. The spinal cord ends at L2. That will become a very important spot for us because if you're going to do a spinal tap and get a sample of cerebrospinal fluid, you're going to want to stick the needle through the meninges below L2. And the anatomical mark for that is the top of the iliac crest. That's not the last time I'll say that. So this is a very important anatomical landmark. But for today, for general anatomy, you can see that the spinal cord is ending here. It's a structure called the conus medullaris. And inferior to the end of the spinal cord, you do not see spinal cord proper. What you see are roots, dorsal and ventral roots. So what in fact is inside the bony canal, the vertebral canal, from L2 down to S5? And the answer is, there's no spinal cord there. It is in fact the roots of the lumbar and sacral region. So people think to themselves, the lower portions of the cord, lumbar and sacral plexus, they think, well, that information is coming off in the lumbar and sacral regions. That's not where it's coming from. That information is coming from higher up. Those nerves, those things that you find in the spinal cord and the vertebral foramen there, are in fact the roots. So it makes for a very useful location for getting cerebrospinal fluid. It's referred to as the cauda equina, these long roots of the spinal cord. The horse's tail. Tail, horse. The horse's tail, the cauda equina. You stick a needle in there, the needle will not hit one of those roots because they're in fluid. It's like trying to stick a piece of spaghetti inside a pot with water. You just can't stick it. All right, almost done here. So the dorsal and ventral roots are long at the cauda equina. The dorsal ventral meningeal rami are the connections to the sympathetic nervous system. So let me show you that. This is also something that we'll do over and over again. When I saw this a second ago, I pointed out the dorsal root ganglia on the dorsal root, and I pointed out the ventral root to you. And here's the spinal nerve, and I said the dorsal rami are going to the deep back muscles. The ventral rami form the plexuses. But in the thoracolumbar division, what part of the nervous system did you just think of? In the thoracolumbar division, from T1 to L2, what did you just think of? In the spinal cord, from T1 to L2, thoracolumbar, what did you just think of for information? Sympathetic nervous system, okay? So in that area, in the thoracolumbar division, we find that there are communicating branches between the spinal cord and the sympathetic chain ganglia. These communicating branches are called rami, communicating rami, or gray and white rami communicantes. And so these will become additional information for us in the sympathetic nervous system as we proceed. They'll come up. The next time they'll come up is when I'm teaching you the details of sympathetic innervation patterns. You're just picking up pieces as you go along through the semester. All right? So, finally, what I've said already, the posterior or dorsal rami follow a simple segmental pattern. That is, there is really no complication to be learned in the dorsal rami. They come off, they go to the deep back muscles. They don't form plexuses, so you can track them. Logically, you can track them logically. You can say, well, this part of the muscle right here, the splenius, for example, the splenius capitis. You can say, well, this upper part of the splenius capitis right here is something's wrong here. That is a C1, or that is a C2, or that is a C3. You can line it up with the spinal cord and guess about these dorsal rami for the deep back muscles. You can do the same thing for the ventral rami from T2 to T12. We call those the intercostal nerves. Where you cannot do that is where the complications of anatomy come in, and those are in what we call the cervical plexus and the brachial plexus. So let me introduce you to the cervical plexus then. Okay, so the cervical plexus breaks out into neat sensory and motor components. And so I'll teach it to you that way. Your book does it this way. It's time to start memorizing these things. Lots of information here. And I've got it all on one picture. All that you need to know here about cervical plexus stuff. The first thing I have that you can see on the left-hand side over here is 1 to 4 superficial, meaning 1, 2, 3, and 4 here are superficial nerves. And you should equate those superficial nerves with sensory information. So the lesser occipital to the lower portion of the occipital bone, it feeds back into 2 and 3. This is posterior and lateral neck. Can I say it? This is the way I memorize it. 1, 2, 3, and 4 here. Lesser occipital, greater auricular, ear, transverse cervical, and supraclavicular. All right, here's how I say it. 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3, 4. 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3, 4. These are the spinal cord segments that receive sensory information from these named sensory nerves. 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3, 4. So you can remember the spinal cord segments and the areas that are receiving sensory information in the cervical plexus from these named nerves. So, lesser occipital, posterior and lateral neck, greater auricular, ear, transverse cervical, anterior and lateral neck, supraclavicular, shoulder and clavicle. The names tell you where they're getting their information. That's the sensory component. The motor component here is where we want to spend most of our time. The motor component is really fits into a couple of categories as well. The first category we would call the segmental branches of the cervical plexus. And the second category I would call the ansa cervicalis. So you can see there's an anterior and a posterior root here labeled of the ansa cervicalis. I'm not going to beat you up with anterior and posterior here. You just remember ansa cervicalis and the segments, you're going to be fine. So, first of all, there are segmental branches, motor components that come off of the spinal cord from the first 5 divisions of the spinal cord, feeding muscles on the front and the back of the neck. These we call the segmental branches, and you can see them coming off of the anterior or ventral rami here. C1, C2, C3, C4, C5. Segmental, 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 segmental. Now, why? Why would I call them segmental? Because they're segmental. You don't have to memorize these either. But you do get information from all 5 of these to the segments on the front and the back of the neck. You'll recognize some of these names. We haven't looked at them yet. The levator scapula, the trapezius, the sternocleidomastoid, the scalenes, the geniohyoid, the sternohyoid, which were on my neck picture a moment ago. The segmental branches of the cervical plexus go to the front and the back of the neck. They don't have to be memorized. You can just say, depending on where you are in the muscle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, here comes the difficulty. So everything so far has been pretty straightforward with the exception of the sensory nerves. 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3, 4. This is where it gets nasty. The ansa cervicalis, as you can see here, picks up information from all 3 of the first 3 cervical segments. 1, 2, and 3. And you can see the connection here. Here's C1, anterior or ventral ramus of C1. This, incidentally, is the hypoglossal connector right here. It's labeled, thank God. It's labeled the hypoglossal connector right here. So you're going to see C1 to C3 by 12. It's because the hypoglossal contributes to this information. So for the omohyoid, the sternohyoid, and the sternothyroid, that's what sterno by 2 means. Omohyoid, sternohyoid, sternothyroid. For those 3, they get information, here it comes, from all 3 segments at the same time. They get information from all 3 at the same time.